Not too long ago, my partner and I found ourselves driving through the vast, quiet expanse of reservation land in the desert southwest. It was late, around 11 o'clock, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything around us. We were on a major highway, but major doesn't mean the same thing out there. The road was barely paved, just a narrow strip of asphalt with one lane in each direction. No streetlights, no signs of life, only the occasional reflector embedded in the road to guide us through the blackness. Out there, it's not uncommon to go an hour or more without passing another car. I was reading aloud from a book, helping to pass the time as my partner, William, focused on the road. We were used to driving through isolated areas, but the quiet can get eerie at times. The only sounds were my voice and the hum of our tires on the road, nothing else for miles around. Suddenly, William interrupted me mid-sentence, his voice urgent. "Did you see that?" he asked, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. I glanced up, startled. "See what?" "That van," he said, his voice tight with concern. "It just went off the road." My heart skipped a beat. I quickly turned in my seat, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever he had seen. But all I saw was darkness, nothing but empty desert stretching endlessly in every direction. There was no sign of a vehicle, no headlights, nothing. "Are you sure?" I asked, squinting into the night. But William was already pulling over onto the side of the road, his expression grim. He grabbed the flashlight we keep in the car for emergencies and handed it to me. "Call 911, he said firmly. He's in the medical field and a licensed EMT, so his mind immediately went to action, instinctively knowing how to handle these situations. I've also worked in emergency response, but even so, the suddenness of it all caught me off guard. There was something unsettling about the whole situation, like a chill in the air I couldn't quite explain. As I dialed 911, I felt a wave of anxiety creep over me. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, with barely any cell service. I kept glancing at my phone, watching the bars flicker between 1 and none. My GPS was acting up too, and I struggled to give the dispatcher a precise location. Eventually, I settled for relaying our GPS coordinates, knowing it was the best I could do given the circumstances. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the phone. "Can you check on the passengers? We'll send help, but it'll take some time to reach you. Cross the highway carefully and let us know if anyone is injured." I hesitated. I had no idea what we were walking into. William had said the van went over the hill, and from what I could tell, it had likely plummeted into the canyon below. The desert terrain was unforgiving steep cliffs, rocky ground, and who knows what else lurking in the dark. I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and carefully crossed the empty highway. The desert air was cool, but I felt sweat forming on my palms as I trudged over the sand dunes. As if things couldn't get more tense, I remembered our conversation from earlier about the local wildlife, specifically the rattlesnakes. I was wearing sandals, which only added to my growing sense of dread. I couldn't see much in front of me, the flashlight barely cutting through the dark, and I had to split my attention between answering the dispatcher's questions and watching where I stepped. After what felt like forever, I finally crested a large dune, and that's when I saw it. The van. It was on its side, half buried in the sand, and teetering dangerously close to the edge of a massive canyon. The moonlight was bright on this side of the hill, casting an almost eerie glow over the scene. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The van had turned on its side as it slid, and the friction from the sand had just barely prevented it from going over the edge. If they'd gone a little farther, they would have plunged straight into the canyon. I heard William's voice calling out to me from the highway. "Can you see anyone?" Just as I was about to answer, I noticed movement near the van. A figure stood by the wreckage, a young man. He was tall and thin, standing unnaturally still, almost like a scarecrow. There was something off about him, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't just the fact that he looked dazed and confused, it was something deeper, something unsettling. He had a dark aura around him, like a shadow that clung to him even in the moonlight. I felt a chill run down my spine, goosebumps rising on my skin. "I see someone," I called back to William, keeping my eyes on the man. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. I approached the van cautiously, shining the flashlight around to get a better look. As I rounded the side of the vehicle, I heard a voice, female, soft but shaky. "Hello, is someone there?" I stepped closer and saw her, a woman crouched inside the passenger cabin. She was pale, with dark hair, and her feet were bleeding from stepping on the broken glass scattered inside the van. Next to her was a massive wolfhound, lying still, looking as stunned as she did. The woman seemed calm, but there was an underlying tension in her voice that made me uneasy. She explained that they were living out of the van and were on their way to Texas to visit family. They had been driving for hours when the accident happened. As she spoke, I tried to convince her to get out of the van just to be safe, in case something shifted and the van slipped closer to the edge. But she refused. She didn't want to leave the dog behind. Something about her demeanor felt strange. She was alert and responsive, but there was a certain coldness in her tone, like she was disconnected from the reality of what had just happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I pushed those thoughts to the back of my mind. People react differently to stress, I told myself. Maybe this was just her way of coping. I relayed the information to the dispatcher, who assured me that the paramedics would be there soon. In the meantime, I kept checking on the woman, making sure she wasn't hurt more than she let on. The man outside the van, however, still gave me the creeps. He wasn't saying much, just standing there, staring into the distance. I kept glancing over at him, making sure he wasn't going to do anything unpredictable. Finally, the paramedics arrived. I waved them down with my flashlight, and they pulled over a little ways from the accident site. As they approached, one of them got a message over the radio, and I saw their expressions change. "Be advised, the male passenger is AMS and considered dangerous," the dispatcher warned. AMS, altered mental status. It meant the man wasn't in his right mind, and for whatever reason, he was considered a potential threat. The paramedics exchanged nervous glances, and one of them went back to the ambulance for more equipment. My heart raced as I rushed back to the accident site, worried for William's safety. He had been talking to the man this whole time, and I hadn't told him about the dispatcher's warning. When I got back, I was relieved to see that everything seemed calm. William and the man were still talking quietly, and nothing appeared to be out of place. I grabbed a pair of shoes from our car for the woman, knowing she couldn't walk in her condition, and handed them to one of the paramedics. They separated the man and the woman, placing them in different ambulances. The police arrived shortly after to take statements and investigate the scene. As we sat by the roadside, waiting for everything to be sorted out, William finally told me what the woman had said when he first got to the van. "She was yelling that the man tried to kill her," he said, his voice low. "She begged me not to leave her alone with him." The woman had been terrified of the man, insisting that he needed to be restrained because he was a danger to himself and others. She claimed he had tried to kill her, though she didn't explain exactly how. William had helped the man out of the van, and although the guy hadn't acted aggressively, he had been eerily quiet. He didn't speak much, just nodded or shook his head in response to questions. William had kept him engaged, trying to prevent him from running off into the desert. But the man had stayed put, waiting for help. The most chilling realization came later. What we had thought was a tragic accident turned out to be something far more sinister. The man had grabbed the wheel and intentionally veered off the road, trying to drive them both over the cliff. If he had chosen any other spot along that highway, they would have gone over the edge immediately. But by some twisted stroke of luck, they crashed in the only area where they could survive. As we drove away that night, the weight of what had happened sank in. If the man had chosen to swerve into our car instead of off the road, we might not have been so lucky. A week later, we returned to the same stretch of highway, this time during the day. The van was gone, and the desert looked deceptively peaceful in the daylight. But standing there, looking out over the canyon, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close we had all come to something much worse. I still think about that woman and her dog, wondering if they're okay. As for the man, I hope he's getting the help he needs. But the desert doesn't give up its secrets easily, and I'll never forget the darkness I saw in his eyes that night. I thought he was just a friendly guy. I met him at a festival, the kind that lights up small towns with music, laughter, and the sound of raindrops on tents. I was there to enjoy the night, get away from the usual routine. That's when he approached me. He said I was beautiful, asked where I was from. I told him I lived about an hour away in a small town, but didn't say its name. He smiled, said his name was James, and mentioned that he was from the States. It was raining, and it felt like a perfect scene from some romantic movie, except it wasn't. Before he left, he handed me a business card. He said he hosted festivals like this one in his own community and thought I might be interested in attending one. I took the card, not thinking much of it, and went about the rest of my night. Festivals always seem to come and go like a blur, and soon it was time to go back to my normal life. 4 days later, back at home, I was working my shift at the local deli, slicing meat like I did every other day. And then, there he was, James, the man from the festival, standing right in front of me. My heart skipped a beat, not from excitement, but from confusion and fear. How did he find me? He noticed the wristband still wrapped around my arm from the festival and said, "You're the girl from the festival, right?" He didn't buy anything, didn't even pretend to be there for groceries. Instead, he just stood there talking to me, asking random questions, while I tried to help other customers. I was trapped behind the counter, and the longer he stayed, the more uncomfortable I became. He followed me to the cash register, keeping the conversation going as if we were old friends. I tried to stay polite, but inside, I was screaming. I just wanted him to leave. Finally, he told me he wouldn't leave unless I gave him a hug. I didn't know what to do. I felt so trapped, so scared. Hoping it would make him go away, I reluctantly gave him a quick hug. He smiled, thanked me, and finally walked out the door. I let out a sigh of relief. But that wasn't the end of it. Later that day, I told my mom what had happened. She immediately pulled out her phone and looked him up online. What she found was horrifying. James wasn't just some random guy. He was part of a commune called the Rainbow People. According to what we read, they prey on young women, brainwashing them into leaving their families, cutting off ties with the outside world, and joining their isolated community. I was terrified. It hit me that I had narrowly escaped something much darker than I'd realized. And that was just the beginning of my encounters with unsettling strangers. Years ago, I made a huge decision that would change my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. I moved to a different country far across the ocean to be with my boyfriend while pursuing my PhD. At first, it felt like an exciting adventure, something straight out of a dream. But dreams often take strange turns. The excitement faded quickly. I found myself feeling more alone than ever. I was in a foreign land, far from my family and friends, and despite having my boyfriend by my side, there was a deep loneliness that crept in. I missed the feeling of human connection, of being understood. My boyfriend was wonderful, but he couldn't fill the void that came with being a stranger in a new place. I've always been a little naive, seeing the best in people, even when I shouldn't. It's a trait that's gotten me into trouble more than once. This time would be no different. My boyfriend and I were into BDSM, but we kept it private, something we shared between us. We didn't go to events or participate in the wider BDSM community. I did, however, have an account on a BDSM website. It was mostly for inspiration, a place where I could get new ideas for our sessions. Occasionally, I'd post a picture, nothing revealing, just me in a wig, with no identifiable features like tattoos or my face showing. Like clockwork, I'd get messages from people trying to dom me. Most of them were copy-paste messages, which I'd ignore. But then, I received a message from a guy named Nick. His message was different. He wasn't trying to get me to be his sub. Instead, he asked how I got into BDSM. He seemed genuinely curious. That's how our conversation started. It wasn't flirtatious or inappropriate. We just talked. He told me he was a police officer who worked on drug cartel investigations and that he was married with kids. Somehow, that made me trust him more. We even had a lot of the same hobbies, specific ones that not many people share. Our conversations continued for months, and eventually, we switched from messaging on the website to texting on WhatsApp. My boyfriend knew about it from the start. We had a trusting relationship. Besides, Nick was married, so I thought it was all innocent. But things started to change. After about 3 months of chatting, Nick said he was coming to a town near me to interview a suspect and asked if we could meet for coffee. I thought, why not? We had been talking for so long, and I considered him a friend. What could go wrong? We met at a local cafe, and it felt like we had known each other for years. We talked, laughed, and for a moment, I felt like I had found a friend in this foreign country. He even showed me his police gear, handcuffs, investigation tools, stuff like that. It didn't feel strange at the time. I was just happy to have someone to connect with. But then, things took a turn I didn't expect. As we were grabbing drinks from a nearby bar later that evening, he suddenly pushed me against the wall and kissed me. I was stunned. I barely managed to push him away and told him that it was completely inappropriate. He was married. I was in a relationship. This wasn't okay. He apologized over and over, saying he thought there was something between us. Yeah, it's called friendship, I replied, disappointed and a bit shaken. We parted ways that night, and I hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few days later, Nick called me, apologizing again. He asked if we could meet up once more, offering to take me on a ride through his hometown. I foolishly agreed, thinking it would be safe. After all, it was his hometown, where he lived with his wife and kids. What could possibly happen? Well, it happened again. He kissed me, tried to push for more, right there in the middle of a park where his children played. I told him to take me back to the bus station, and thankfully, he did. But before I left, he told me a chilling story. He said he once tricked a drug dealer by faking text messages, making the guy think his girlfriend was cheating on him. The dealer confronted her, and that's when Nick swooped in to arrest him. I don't know if the story was true, but in that moment, all I could think was, is he telling me he can do the same to me? From that point on, I was terrified. Nick's behavior became more erratic, more obsessed. He started telling me how much he loved me, how we'd be a great couple, how I should leave my boyfriend for him. I knew I had to cut ties, but I was scared of what he might do. I blocked him on everything, but he found ways to contact me. He even sent me messages with my address, saying how much he liked my neighborhood. I never gave him my address. Being a cop, he must have pulled some strings. The pandemic lockdown was a strange blessing. I didn't hear from him for months. But then I got a new phone, and all my blocked numbers were unblocked. Days later, a message from Nick popped up. He told me he'd divorced his wife and wanted to marry me. He apologized for treating me like a mistress and said I deserved better. I blocked him again, and soon after, we moved to a new place. I still wonder if he'll find me again. All I can do is hope he doesn't.